This week, Occupy Wall Street went global. From Rome to Paris to New York and across the United States, thousands have been rallying against corporate greed and government dysfunction, but also their fears about the unemployment situation. Their collective voice now too loud to be dismissed, and their anger yet another symptom of the crisis which grips this country and the world. So where does that leave the policy debate? Joining me again, George Will, Bloomberg Television's Margaret Brennan, Laura Tyson, who's a member of the President's Jobs Council and former Clinton administration economic advisor, and ABC's John Karl again. Thank you very much again for being here. Margaret, you're down at Wall Street every single day. What are people inside the stock exchange making of what's going on outside?
It was interesting because I'm inside New York Stock Exchange every day, and I went down to talk to the protesters on Friday. And the frustrations inside and outside are similar. 45 million Americans on food stamps, 14 million Americans unemployed. But inside of Wall Street, they're more angry at what's not happening in Washington, the lack of clarity, the lack of momentum. And outside, they're sort of attacking the symbol of banks and the symbol of money. And it's not quite clear what they're asking for, but the frustration is something that people are definitely noticing.
Well, their frustration, the Wall Street bankers' frustration about Washington, you're on the President's Jobs Council. What is going to happen? I mean, what is going to make some kind of impact in this jobs crisis right now?
Well, you know, the Jobs Act that just went down to first round defeat that you talked about in the earlier segment has been evaluated by a very large number of economists, and they have said repeatedly it could actually have an effect. It could create a couple million jobs next year. It could increase the GDP growth rate a couple percentage points. It could reduce the unemployment rate by 8 percentage points. This is a serious plan. The parts of the plan that are the major parts, payroll tax relief, infrastructure, unemployment compensation with reform, these are things that have been supported on both sides of the aisle historically. A real plan that comes with bipartisan support. It's a tragedy if that plan does not pass, because it's a serious effort evaluated to have a real effect.
But even Mark Zandi, who seems to be the White House's favorite economist who worked
but he's not the only one,
has suggested that yes, it would have an impact in the short run, but not in the long term. There would be a drag on the economy.
The point is, next year without it, you have to think about next year, 2012. Next year, because of what's already in the books, the government will be taking out of the economy nearly 2 percentage points. The economy is on the brink of recession, a double dip recession. The probability of recession, a wide group of economists think it's about 30%. If we don't do something for next year, government policy will actually increase the odds that we go into recession. So increase the odds.
Let me ask you, George, because you know business leaders are getting very worried, including people who are Democratic leading, like Mort Zuckerman, who had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this weekend, basically saying that he and his business leader colleagues and friends are beginning to think that this government's policies are failing in this regard. What do you see what do you see happening, for instance, next year, this time next year, in this regard?
A political convulsion if we start a recession at 9.1% unemployment, right. 16.5% either unemployed, partially employed, or too discouraged to seek employment. 22% of mortgage holders underwater at this point. I mean, it's an astonishing place to start a recession. I think there's one potential plank, if you can call it that, of Occupy Wall Street that's about to go mainstream, and that's debt repudiation. You see it now from some of the mainstream economists. These are the same geniuses, by the way, who said if we passed the stimulus, we would have unemployment at 8% or less. And that is, your mainstream economists say, we need just a little bit of inflation in a narrow band, 4 to 6%, just for a little while. Now, behind this fatal conceit that they can control inflation, have just a little bit of it with a thermostat to turn it up or down, inflation is debt repudiation. It's just the civilized and surreptitious way to get out from under debt. And here you have, I mean, the big number that Occupy Wall Street is preoccupied with is $1 trillion in student loan debt.
Right. You talk about a social convulsion. Well, it's kind of already sort of starting in Wall Street and around the world. What's the single biggest problem, Laura, clouding the jobs picture? I mean, you've been quoted as saying there are a lot of jobs, but there are not the skills to match the jobs.
Well, I think you have to be careful of that. I do agree that there's a skills mismatch, but I also think the predominant problem for unemployment right now is the lack of spending. It's the lack of demand. consumers are on their backs. The savings rate is going up. They have a lot of debt. They can't consume. They're worried about their jobs. They don't have jobs. They can't consume. 70% of the economy, it was the engine of growth. It's off. It's running at a very low. So it's demand. I think that the skills issue is very important because as you're thinking about what to do now to create jobs, you want to deal with the skills problems going forward. So that's why, so the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, one of the things we're focusing on is essentially programs to build advanced manufacturing skills or healthcare skills or to build more engineers. That creates jobs now, creates capabilities now, but it also deals with the skills mismatch going forward. But infrastructure spending right now in a way which benefits the economy going forward, that's, I think, what we need to do. That's why I think infrastructure is so important.
You have corporations saying, you know, we could hire, but we don't have people who have the skill set we want. Why aren't you not protesting outside Wall Street? Why aren't you protesting at universities? Right. And the issue of confidence is a great one, but for a corporation to take someone on a payroll and take on that, they need to have the confidence that we're not going to stay on the precipice of recession. And arguably the conversations in Paris at the G20 this weekend are a huge part of restoring confidence and saying we're not going to allow for another banking crisis to infect all of Europe and the globe.
And a chunk of the jobs bill is telling companies who to hire. I mean, you get a better tax credit if you hire somebody who's been unemployed for 6 months. You get an additional tax credit if you hire a veteran.
I think a chunk would be a little exaggeration. Most of it, let's think about that bill. It's about 270 billion is general payroll tax relief. About 100 is
which
infrastructure.
Which has a good chance of passing. So, and I think that actually a good chunk of that, I mean, that will pass. There's bipartisan support for the payroll tax. There's bipartisan support for some infrastructure, which makes you wonder why have we spent a month and a half debating a bill that had no chance of passing in its form.
So let me ask you this, because one of the economic plans is the 999 plan of Herman Cain.
Yes.
I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago on this program, and this is what he said about the sales tax portion of it. You talk about 9% corporate, 9% income tax, and a 9% national sales tax.
Yes.
And economists are saying that that could actually disproportionately affect poorer people, African Americans, and all sorts of poorer people.
Ask them to do the math.
Well, look, on the sales tax part of the plan, we did do the math. The plan, there are currently 5 states without their own sales taxes, including New Hampshire. So under Cain's plan, all those people would go from paying nothing to paying 9%. Cain's tax would be an additional burden in states with sales taxes already on the books. And look at this, there are 26 states with current sales taxes at or above 6%. So under Cain's plan, that number would soar to at least 15%. So it's catchy, but is it really something that's going to work, George?
Well, the danger right now is, as Laura says, the United States economy is driven by consumer spending, which is fueled by consumer credit. On the other hand, the American people consume too much and save too little, much too little. We had a savings rate of 9% in the 1980s, 5% in the 90s. In 2005, the savings rate went negative. The consumption went on because people took out home equity loans in the sure and certain confidence that housing prices never decline. That didn't work out so well.
The other problem is the math doesn't add up. Bloomberg crunched the numbers and it comes in about $200 billion short in revenue unless you keep part of the current tax structure, which is the excise tax on beer, on cigarettes, and if you exempt, he said, used goods, which I guess means a home and a car.